Hello and welcome back to my live stream. Now, hello and welcome back to my live stream. For this episode, for this video, I'll be going through Dale Carnegie Part 3, Dale Carnegie's book. Welcome back, and we will be continuing with Part 3, How to Win People to Your Way of Thinking. Look at that. Welcome back. I will be continuing. Welcome back. Welcome back. I'll be continuing with Part 3, How to Win People to Your Way of Thinking. Chapter 1, You Can't Win an Argument. Shortly after the close of World War I learned an invaluable lesson one night in London. I was a manager at the time for Sir Ross Smith. During the war, Sir Ross had been the Australian ace out of Palestine, and shortly after peace was declared, he astonished the world by flying halfway around it in 30 days. No such feat had ever been attempted before. It created a tremendous sensation. The Australian government awarded him $50,000. The King of England knighted him, and for a while he was the most talked about man under the Union Jack. I was attending a banquet one night given in Sir Ross's honour, and during the dinner the man sitting next to him told a humorous story which hinged on the quotation, "There's a divinity that shapes our ends, rough hew them how we will." The raconteur mentioned that the quotation was from the Bible. He was wrong. I knew it. I knew it positively. There couldn't have been the slightest doubt about it. And so, to get a feeling of importance and display my superiority, I appointed myself as an unsolicited and unwelcome committee of one to correct him. He stuck to his guns. What, from Shakespeare? Impossible. Absurd. That quotation was from the Bible, and he knew it. The storyteller was sitting on my right, and Frank Gammon, an old friend of mine, was seated at my left. Mr. Gammon had devoted years to the study of Shakespeare, so the storyteller and I agreed to submit the question to Mr. Gammon. Mr. Gammon listened, kicked me under the table, then said, "Dale, you are wrong. That gentleman is right. It is from the Bible." On our way home that night, I said to Mr. Gammon, "Frank, you knew the quotation was from Shakespeare." "Yes, of course," he replied. "Hamlet, Act 5, Scene 2. But we would guess at a festive occasion, my dear Dale. Why prove a man he is wrong? Is that going to make him like you? Why not let him save his face? He didn't ask for your opinion, he didn't want it. Why argue with him? Always avoid the acute angle." The man who said that taught me a lesson I'll never forget. I not only made the storyteller uncomfortable, but had put my friend in an embarrassing situation. How much better could it have been had I not become argumentative? It was sorely needed lesson because I had been an inveterate arguer. During my youth, I had argued with my brother about everything under the Milky Way. When I went to college, I studied logic and argumentation and went in for debating courses. Talk about being from Missouri, I was born there. I had to be shown. Later, I taught debating and argumentation in New York. And once, I am ashamed to admit it, I plan to write a book on the subject. Since then, I listened to, engaged in, and watched the effect of thousands of arguments. As a result of this, I have come to the conclusion that there is only one way under the high heaven to get the best of an argument, and that is to avoid it. Avoid it as if you would avoid rattlesnakes and earthquakes. 9 times out of 10, an argument ends with each of the contestants more firmly convinced than ever he is absolutely right. You can't win an argument. You can't because if you lose it, you lose it. And if you win it, you lose it. Why? Well, suppose you triumph over the other man and shooting his argument full of holes and to prove that he is non compos mentis. Then what? You will feel fine, but what about him? You made him feel inferior. You have hurt his pride. He will resent your triumph, and a man convinced against his will is of the same opinion still. Years ago, Patrick J. O'Hare joined one of my classes. He had had little education, and how he loved a scrap. He had once been a chauffeur, and he came to me because he had been trying, without much success, to sell trucks. A little questioning brought out the fact that he was continually scrapping with and antagonizing the very people he was trying to do business with. If the prospect said anything derogatory about the trucks he was selling, Pat saw red and was right at the customer's throat. Pat won a lot of arguments in those days. As he said to me, I often walked out of an office saying, I told that bird something. Sure, I had told him something, but I hadn't sold him anything. My first problem was not to teach Patrick J. O'Hare to talk. My immediate task was to train him to refrain from talking and to avoid verbal fights. Mr. O'Hare became one of the star salesmen for the White Motor Company in New York. How did he do it? Here is his story in his own words. If I walk into the buyer's office now and he says, what? A white truck? They're no good. I wouldn't take one if you gave it to me. I'm going to buy the Who's It truck. I say, the Who's It is a good truck, but if you buy a Who's It, you'll never make a mistake. The Who's Its are made by a fine company and sold by good people. He is speechless then. There is no room for an argument. If he says the Who's It is best and I say sure it is, he has to stop. But I can't keep on all afternoon saying it's the best. When I'm agreeing with him, we then get the subject of Who's It and I begin to talk about the good points of that white truck. There was a time when a remark like the first one would have made me scarlet and red and orange. I would start arguing the Who's It, and the more I argued against it, the more my prospect argued in favor of it. The more he argued, the more he sold himself to my competitor's product. As soon as I look back, now I wonder how I was ever able to sell anything. I lost years of my life in scrapping and arguing. I keep my mouth shut now, it pays. As wise old Ben Franklin used to say, if you argue and rankle and contradict, you may achieve a victory sometimes, but it will be an empty victory because you will never get your opponent's goodwill. So if you figure it out, which would you rather have, an academic, theatrical victory or a person's goodwill? You can seldom have both. The Boston Transcript once printed this bit of significant doggerel. Here lies the body of William J., who died maintaining his right of way. He was right, dead right, as he sped along, but he's just as dead as if he were wrong. Well, you may be right, dead right, as you speed along in your argument, but as far as changing another's mind is concerned, you will probably be just as futile as if you were wrong. Frederick S. Parsons, an income tax consultant, had been disputing and wrangling for an hour with a government tax inspector. An item of $9,000 was at stake. Mr. Parsons claimed that his $9,000 was in reality a bad debt, that it would never be collected, that it ought not to be taxed. Bad debt, my eye, retorted the inspector. It must be taxed. This inspector was cold, arrogant, and stubborn. Mr. Parsons said as he told the story to the class, reason was wasted and so were facts. The longer we argued, the more stubborn we became. So I decided to avoid argument, change the subject, and give him appreciation. I said, I suppose this is a very petty matter in comparison with really important and difficult questions you're required to make. I've made a study of taxation myself, but I've had to get knowledge from books. You are getting yours from the firing line of experience. I sometimes wish I had a job like yours. It would teach me a lot. I meant every word I said. Well, the inspector straightened up in his chair, leaned back, and talked for a long time about his work, telling me of the clever frauds he had uncovered. This tone gradually became friendly, and presently he was telling me about his children. As he left, he advised me that he would consider my problem further and give me his decision in a few days. He called at my office 3 days later and informed me that he had decided to leave the tax return exactly as it was filed. His tax inspector This tax inspector was demonstrating one of the most common of human frailties. He wanted the feeling of importance. As long as Mr. Parsons argued with him, he got his feeling of importance by loudly asserting his authority. But as soon as his importance was admitted and the argument stopped and he was permitted to expand his ego, he became a sympathetic and kindly human being. Buddha said, "Hatred is never ended by hatred, but by love. And a misunderstanding is never ended by an argument, but by tact, diplomacy, conciliation, and sympathetic desire to see the other person's viewpoint." Lincoln once reprimanded a young army officer for indulging in violent controversy with an associate. "No man who is resolved to make the most of himself," said Lincoln, "can you spare the time for personal contention. Still less can he afford to take the consequences, including the vitiation of his temper and the loss of self-control. Yield larger things to which show no more than equal rights, and yield lesser ones, though clearly your own. Better give your path to a dog than be bitten by him in contesting for the right. Even killing the dog would not cure the bite." I like that. In an article in Bits and Pieces, some suggestions are made on how to keep a disagreement from becoming an argument. Welcome the disagreement. Remember the slogan: when two partners always agree, one of them is not necessary. If there is some point you haven't thought about, be thankful if it is brought to your attention. Perhaps this disagreement is your opportunity to be corrected before you make a serious mistake. Distrust your first instinctive impression. Our first natural reaction in a disagreeable situation is to be defensive. Be careful, be calm, and watch out for your first reaction. It may be you at your worst, not your best. Control your temper. Remember, you can measure the size of a person by what makes him or her angry. Listen first. Give your opponents a chance to talk. Let them finish. Do not resist, defend, or debate. This only raises barriers. Try to build bridges of understanding. Don't build higher barriers of misunderstanding. Look for areas of agreement. When you have heard your opponents out, dwell first on the points and areas on which you agree. Be honest. Look for areas where you can admit and say so. Apologize for your mistakes. It will help disarm your opponent and reduce defensiveness. Promise to think over your opponent's ideas and study them carefully, and mean it. Your opponents may be right. It is a lot easier at this stage to agree and think about the points than move rapidly ahead and find yourself in a position where your opponents can say, "We tried to tell you, but you wouldn't listen." Thank your opponent sincerely for their interest. Anyone who takes the time to disagree with you is interested in the same things you are. Think of them as people who really want to help you, and you may turn your opponents into friends. Postpone action to give both sides time to think through the problem. Suggest that a new meeting be held later that day or the next day. When all facts may be brought in to bear, in preparation for this meeting, ask yourself some hard questions. Could my opponents be right? Partly right? Is there truth or merit in their position or argument? Is my reaction one that will relieve the problem, or will it just relieve any frustration? Will my reaction drive my opponents further away or draw them closer to me? Will my reaction elevate the estimation good people have of me? Will I win or lose? What price will I have to pay if I win? If I'm quiet about it, will the disagreement blow over? It is a difficult situation, an opportunity for me. Opera tenor Jan Pearce, after he was married nearly 50 years, once said, "My wife and I made a pact a long time ago, and we've kept it no matter how angry we've grown with each other. When one yells, the other should listen. When two people yell, there is no communication, just noise and bad vibrations." Principle 1. The only way to get the best of an argument is to avoid it. Well, in the discussion for this chapter, accepting your rival in an argument or opponent in an argument or a debate, acknowledging and validating the cons, does help in disarming their intentions. You know, if you let them flex and get through their diatribe or speech quickly, usually I've noticed people run out of things to say. Seldom do I find people that just keep repeating the same things over and over again to the point where you just, give up out of sheer, like hitting your, I forgot the word, like hitting your head against a brick wall, basically, trying to convince someone. Don't convince them. If they want to be stupid, let them be stupid. You don't have to convince everyone of your particular point of view. And you don't really have to accept what the other person has to say either. All right. Chapter 2. A sure way of making enemies and how to avoid it. When Theodore Roosevelt was in the White House, he confessed that he could be right 75% of the time. He would reach the highest measure of his expectation if that was the highest rating that one of the most distinguished men of the 20th century could hope to obtain. What about you and me? If you can be sure of being right only 55% of the time, you can go down Wall Street and make $1 million a day. If you can't be sure of being right even 55% of the time, why should you tell other people they are wrong? You can tell people they're wrong by a look or an intonation or a gesture just as eloquently as you can in words. And if you tell them that they are wrong, do you make them want to agree with you? Never. For you have struck a direct blow at their intelligence, judgment, pride, and self-respect. That will make you want to strike back, but it will never make them want to change their minds. You may then hurl at them all the logic of Plato or Immanuel Kant, but you will not alter their opinions, for you have hurt their feelings. Never begin by announcing, I am going to prove so and so to you. That's bad. That's tantamount to saying, I'm smarter than you are. I'm going to tell you a thing or two that can make you change your mind. That is a challenge. It arouses opposition and makes the listener want to battle with you before you even start. It is difficult under even the most benign conditions to change people's minds. So why make it harder? Why handicap yourself? To prove anything, don't let anybody know it. Do it subtly, so adroitly, that no one will feel that you are doing it. This is expressed succinctly by Alexander Pope. Men must be taught as if you taught them not, and things unknown proposed as things forgot. Over 300 years ago, Galileo said, you cannot teach a man anything. You can only help him and find it within himself. Sorry, let me repeat that. You cannot teach a man anything. You can only help him to find it within himself. As Lord Chesterfield said to his son, be wiser than other people if you can, but do not tell them so. Socrates said repeatedly to his followers in Athens, Socrates said repeatedly to his followers in Athens, one thing only I know, and that is that I know nothing. Well, I can't hope to be any smarter than Socrates, so I have quit telling people they're wrong, and I find that it pays. If a person makes a statement that you think is wrong, yes, even that you know is wrong, isn't it better to begin by saying, well, now look, I thought otherwise, but I may be wrong. I frequently am. And if I am wrong, you want to be put right, let's examine the facts. There's magic, positive magic, in such phrases as I may be wrong, I frequently am, let's examine the facts. Nobody in heavens above or on earth beneath or in the waters under the earth will ever object to your saying I may be wrong, let's examine the facts. One of our class members who used this approach in dealing with customers was Harold Rank, a Dodge dealer in Billings, Montana. He reported that because of the pressures of automobile businesses, he was often hard-boiled and callous when dealing with customers' complaints. This caused flared tempers, loss of business, and general unpleasantness. He told his class, recognizing that this was getting me nowhere fast, I tried a new track. I would say something like this. Our dealership has made so many mistakes that I am frequently ashamed. We may have erred in your case. Tell me about it. This approach becomes quite disarming, and by the time the customer releases his feelings, he usually much more reasonable when it comes to settling the matter. In fact, several customers have thanked me for having such an understanding attitude, and 2 of them have even brought in friends to buy new cars. In this highly competitive market, we need more of this type of customer, and I believe that showing respect for all customers' opinions and treating them diplomatically and courteously will help beat the competition. You will never get into trouble by admitting that you may be wrong, that you will stop all arguments and inspire your opponent to be just as fair and open and broad-minded as you are. It will make him want to admit that he too may be wrong. If you know positively that a person is wrong and you bluntly tell him or her so, what happens? Let me illustrate. Mr. S., a young New York attorney, once argued a rather important case before United States Supreme Court, Lusgarten v. versus Fleet Corporation, 280 U.S. 320. The case involved a considerable sum of money and an important question of law. During the argument, one of the Supreme Court justices said to him, "The statute of limitations in admiralty law is 6 years, is it not?" Mr. S. stopped, stared at the justice for a moment, and then said abruptly, "Your Honor, there is no statute of limitations in admiralty." A hush fell on the court, said Mr. S., as he related his experience to one of the author's classes, and temperature in the room seemed to drop to 0. "I was right, Justice was wrong, and I had told him so, but did that make him friendly? No. I still believe that I have the law on my side, and I know that I spoke better than I ever spoke before. But I didn't persuade. I made an enormous blunder of telling a learned and famous man that he was wrong. Few people are logical. Most of us are prejudiced and biased. Most of us are blighted with preconceived notions, with jealousy, suspicion, fear, envy, and pride, and most citizens don't want to change their minds about their religion or their haircut or communism or the favorite movie star. So if you are inclined to tell people they're wrong, please read the following paragraph every morning before breakfast. It is from James Harvey Robinson's enlightening book, The Mind in the Making. We sometimes find ourselves changing our minds without resistance or heavy emotion. But if we are told we are wrong, we resent the imputation and harden our hearts. We are incredibly heedless in the formation of our beliefs, but find ourselves filled with the illicit passion for them. When anyone proposes to rob us of our companionship, it is obviously not the ideas themselves that are dear to us, but our self-esteem which is threatened. The little word "my" is the most important one in human affairs. Properly to reckon with it is the beginning of wisdom. It has the same force whether it is my dinner, my dog, my house, or my father, my country, and my God. But not only resent the imputation to our watch is wrong, or our car shabby, but our conception of the canals of Mars, of our pronunciation of Epictetus, of the medicinal value of salicin, or the date of Sargon I is subject to revision. We like to continue to believe what we have been accustomed to accept as true, and resentment aroused when doubt is cast upon any of our assumptions leads us to seek every manner of excuse for clinging to it. The result is most of our so-called reasoning consists of finding arguments for going on believing as we already do. Carl Rogers, the eminent psychologist, wrote in his book On Becoming a Person, I have found of it enormous value when I can permit myself to understand the other person. The way in which I have worded this statement may seem strange to you. It is necessary to permit oneself to understand another. I think it is. Our first reaction to most of the statements which we hear from other people is an evaluation or judgment rather than an understanding of it. When someone expresses some feeling, attitude, or belief, our tendency is almost immediately to feel that's right, or that's stupid, that's abhorrent, that's abnormal, that's unreasonable, that's incorrect, that's not nice. Very rarely do we permit ourselves to understand precisely what the meaning of the statement is to the other person. I once employed an interior decorator to make some draperies for my home. When the bill arrived, I was dismayed. A few days later, a friend dropped in and looked at the draperies. The price was mentioned, and she exclaimed with a note of triumph, "What? That's awful. I am afraid he put one over you." True. Yes, she told the truth, but few people like to listen to truths that reflect on their judgment. So being human, I try to defend myself. I pointed that the best is eventually the cheapest. One can't expect to get quality and artistic taste at bargain basement prices, and so on and on. The next day, another friend dropped in, admired the draperies, bubbled over with enthusiasm, and expressed a wish that she could afford such exquisite creations for her home. My reaction was totally different. Well, to tell the truth, I said, I can't afford them myself. I paid too much. I'm sorry, I ordered them. When we are wrong, we admit it to ourselves, and if we are handled gently and tactfully, we may admit it to others and even pride in our frankness and broad-mindedness, but not if someone else is trying to ram an unpalatable fact down our esophagus. Horace Greeley, the most famous editor in America, during the time of the Civil War, disagreed violently with Lincoln's policies. He believed that he could drive Lincoln into agreeing with him by a campaign of argument, ridicule, and abuse. He waged his bitter campaign months after month, year after year. In fact, he wrote a brutal, bitter, sarcastic, and personal attack on President Lincoln the night Booth shot him. But did all this bitterness make Lincoln agree to Greeley? Not at all. Ridicule and abuse never do. If you want some excellent suggestion about dealing with people, managing yourself, and improving your personality, read Benjamin Franklin's autobiography, one of the most fascinating life stories ever written, one of the classics of American literature. Ben Franklin tells how he conquered the iniquitous habit of argument and transformed himself into one of the most able, suave, diplomatic men in American history. One day, when Ben Franklin was a blundering youth, an old Quaker friend took him aside and lashed him with a few stinging truths, something like this: "Ben, you are impossible. Your opinions have a slap in them for everyone who differs with you. They have become so offensive that nobody cares for them. Your friends find they enjoy themselves better when you are not around. You know so much that no one can tell you anything. Indeed, no man is going to try, for the effort would lead only to discomfort and hard work. So you are not likely ever to know any more than you do now," which is very little. One of the finest things I know about Ben Franklin is the way he accepted that smarting rebuke. He was big enough and wise enough to realize that it was true, to sense that he was headed for failure and social disaster, so he made a right about face. He began immediately to change his insolent, opinionated ways. "I made it a rule," said Franklin, "to forbear all direct contradiction to the sentiment of others and all positive assertion of my own. I even forbade myself to use every word and expression in the language that imported a fixed opinion, such as certainly, undoubtedly, etc. And I adopted instead of them, I conceive, I apprehend, or I imagine a thing to be so, or it appears to me at present. When another asserted something that I thought an error, I'd deny myself the pleasure of contradicting him abruptly. And now showing immediately some absurdity in his proposition, and in answering, I began observing that in certain cases or circumstances, his opinion would be right. But in present case, there appeared to, or seemed to, some difference, etc. I soon found the advantage of this change in my manner. The conversations I had engaged in went on more pleasantly. The modest way in which I proposed my opinions procured them a readier reception and less contradiction. I had less mortification when I found to be in the wrong, and I more easily prevailed with others to give up on their mistakes and join with me when I happened to be right. And this mode, which I first put on with some violence to natural inclination, became at length so easy and so habitual to me that perhaps for these 50 years past no one has ever heard a dogmatical expression escape me. And to this habit, after my character of integrity, I think it principally owing that I had earned so much weight with my fellow citizens when I proposed new institutions or alterations in the old, and so much influence in public councils when I became a member, for I was but a bad speaker, never eloquent, subject to much hesitation in my choice of words, hardly correct in language, and yet I generally carried my points. How do Ben Franklin's methods work in business? Let's take two examples. Catherine A. Elred of Kings Mountain, North Carolina, is an industrial engineering supervisor for a yarn processing plant. She told one of our classes how she handled a sensitive problem before or after taking our training. Part of my responsibility, she reported, deals with setting up and maintaining incentive systems and standards for our operations so they can make more money by producing more yarn. The system we were using The system we were using worked fine when we had only 2 or 3 different types of yarn. But recently, we had expanded our inventory and capabilities to enable us to run more than 12 different varieties. The present system was no longer adequate to pay the operators fairly for the work being performed and give them incentive to increase production. I had worked up a new system which would enable us to pay the operator by the class of yarn which was running at any one particular time. With my new system in hand, I entered the meeting determined to prove to the management that my system was the right approach. I told them in detail how they were wrong and showed they were being unfair and how I had all the answers they needed. To say at least, I failed miserably. I had become so busy defending my position on the new system that I had left them no opening to graciously admit their problems on the old one. The issue was dead. After several sessions of this course, I realized all too well where I had made my mistakes. I called another meeting at this time where I asked where they felt their problems were. We discussed each point, and I asked them their opinions on which was the best way to proceed. Let them develop my system themselves. At the end of the meeting, when I actually presented my system, they enthusiastically accepted it. I am convinced now that nothing good is accomplished, and a lot of damage can be done if you tell a person straight out that he or she is wrong. Only succeed in stripping that person of self-dignity, and make yourself an unwelcome part of any discussion. Let's take another example, and remember, these cases I am citing are typical of experiences of thousands of people. R.V. Crowley was a salesman for a lumber company in New York. Crowley admitted that he had been telling hard-boiled lumber inspectors for years that they were wrong. And he had won the arguments too, but it hadn't done any good. For these lumber inspectors, said Mr. Crowley, are like baseball umpires. Once they make a decision, they never change it. Mr. Crowley saw that his firm was losing thousands of dollars through the arguments he won. So while taking my course, he resolved to change tactics and abandon arguments. With what results? Here is the story as he told it to fellow members of his class. One morning, the phone rang in my office. A hot and bothered person on the other end proceeded to inform me that a car of lumber he had shipped into his plant was entirely unsatisfactory. His firm had stopped unloading and requested that we make immediate arrangements to remove the stock from their yards. After about 1/4 of the car had been unloaded, their lumber inspector reported that the lumber was running 55% below grade. Under the circumstances, they refused to accept it. I immediately started for his plant and on the way turned over in my mind the best way to handle this situation. Ordinarily, under such circumstances, I should have quoted grading rules and tried, as a result of my own experience and knowledge as a lumber inspector, to convince the other inspector that the lumber was actually up to grade and that he was misinterpreting the rules on his inspection. I lost my place. No, I've actually lost my place. Ordinarily, under such circumstances, I should have quoted grading rules and tried, as a result of my own experience and knowledge as a lumber inspector, to convince the other inspector that the lumber was actually up to grade and that he was misinterpreting the rules of his inspection. However, I thought I would apply the principles learned in this training. When I arrived at the plant, I found the purchasing agent and the lumber inspector in a wicked humor, both set for an argument and a fight. We walked out of the car that was being unloaded, and I requested that we continue to unload so that I could see how things were going. I asked the inspector to go right ahead and lay out the rejects, as he had been doing, and put the good pieces in another pile. After watching him for a while, it began to dawn on me that his inspection actually was much too strict, that he was misinterpreting the rules. This particular lumber was white pine. And I knew the inspector was thoroughly schooled in hard words and not competent. Experienced inspector on white pine. White pine happened to be my own strong suit. But did I offer any objection to the way he was grading the lumber? None. Whatever, I kept on watching and gradually began to ask questions as to why certain pieces were not satisfactory. I didn't for one instant insinuate that the other inspector was wrong. I emphasized that my only reason for asking was in order that we could give his firm exactly what they wanted in future shipments. By asking questions in a friendly, cooperative spirit and insisting continually that they were in the right and laying out boards not satisfactory to their purpose, I got him warmed up, and the strained relations between us began to thaw and melt away. And occasionally, carefully put remark on my part gave birth to the idea in his mind that possibly some of these rejected pieces were actually within the grade that they had bought, and that their requirements demanded a more expensive grade. I was very careful, however, not to let him think I was making an issue of this point. Gradually, this whole attitude changed. He finally admitted to me that he was not experienced on white pine and began to ask me questions about each piece as it came out of the car. I would explain why such a piece came within grade specified, but kept on insisting that we did not want him to take it if it was unsuitable for their purpose. He finally got to the point where he felt guilty every time he put a piece in the rejected pile. And at last he saw that the mistake was on their part for not having specified as good a grade as they needed. The ultimate outcome was that he went through the entire carload again after I left, accepted the whole lot, and we received a check in full. In that one instance alone, a little tact and determination to refrain from telling the other man he was wrong saved my company a substantial amount of cash, and it would be hard to place a money value on the goodwill that was saved. Martin Luther King was asked how, as a pacifist, he could be the admirer of Air Force General Daniel Chappie James. Then the nation's highest-ranking black officer, Dr. King, replied, "I judge people by their own principles, not by my own." In a similar way, General Robert E. Lee once spoke to the President of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis, in the most glowing terms about a certain officer under his command. Another officer in attendance was astonished. "General," he said, "do you not know that the man of whom you speak of so highly is one of the bitterest enemies who misses no opportunity to malign you?" "Yes," replied General Lee, "but the President asked my opinion of him. He did not ask for his opinion of me. By the way, I am not revealing anything new in this chapter. 2,000 years ago, Jesus said, 'Agree with thine adversary quickly.' And 2,200 years before Christ was born, King Akhtoy of Egypt gave his son some shrewd advice that is sorely needed today. 'Be diplomatic,' counseled the king. 'It will help you gain your point.' In other words, don't argue with your customer or spouse or your adversary. Don't tell them they are wrong. Don't get them stirred up. Use a little diplomacy. Principle 2. Show respect for your other... Let me repeat that. Principle 2. Show respect for the other person's opinions. Never say you're wrong. Well, apologies for the numerous flubbers and flibs during that reading. My throat has gone quite dry since I didn't drink any tea or anything before this. But again, although I don't directly agree, more indirectly with this chapter, when dealing in business, definitely you want to coddle your aggressor, or not opponent, but your co-workers or stuff like that, because you need to work with these people on continuous basis. It's not worth messing up your whole life or their life over small things. I definitely know in my own life that this is certainly situations that I've had to deal with. But yeah, in general terms, I suppose I would agree with Dale on this. I don't know. What are your thoughts? If you do enjoy this video reading, video reading, do leave a comment below. Like and subscribe if you see this on YouTube, and follow me on social. Cheers.